Welcome to the Kingsburg Community Church podcast, Thinking About Faith. We pray that this podcast helps you deepen your faith in God and stir some inner thoughts about the Christian life.
Hi, everyone. This is Pastor Ed, and welcome to the KCC podcast, Thinking About Faith. Today, we're in the third week of an exploration of Dr. Stephen Meyer's book, The Return of the God Hypothesis. And in that book, he outlines three major scientific discoveries in the last 100 years that actually make it much easier to look beyond natural causes for the source of the origins of the universe and of human life. So it's actually a good time to be a scientist and to be a Christian because of discoveries seem to be opening more of a possibility than pure materialistic causes in the universe. The God hypothesis that Stephen Meyer talks about is the hypothesis that perhaps there was a designer to the universe, and that the order and the nature of the universe points to a designer, even as other things that we see that point to a designer. If you happen to be walking in the hills of South Dakota, and you happen to look up and see in a huge granite face what look to be the heads of four human beings, you might be startled to see those in the rock. And you might think, wow, could it possibly have been that erosion and wind and rain and snow over time had made these what appeared to be people's heads stick out of Mount Rushmore? But of course, if you knew a bit of American history and looked closer, you would say, wait a minute, those faces are familiar. I recognize those faces. That one looks like George Washington. That one looks like Abraham Lincoln. The fact that that you could actually recognize not only that those are human heads, but that they're specific human heads, probably a good indication that that was a work of art, that it was designed and it didn't happen by accident through natural forces only. So we're looking at today the third, and actually for my money, the greatest scientific discovery of the last 100 years that points us to the possibility of a designing intelligence behind life. Today, we're not looking at the universe. We're kind of narrowing in specifically to life on Earth. And what happened is that in the 1950s, you probably remember this from your biology class. In the 1950s, two wonderful scientists in the biological sciences and microbiology in the UK, in I believe Cambridge University, Watson and Crick, were able to model the DNA molecule. And the DNA molecule is the foundation of all life. And if you remember learning in science class, the DNA molecule actually it's what's called a double helix. So it looks like, if you can imagine a giant extension ladder that is twisted. So there are two rails on either side. This is the sugar phosphate backbone on either side of it, and then the rungs of the ladder that twist up through the sequence are composed of two nucleotide bases on each rung, and they are ACs. GTs, you probably remember that. They pair together, and these base pairs actually, in sequence, they're kind of a code. And Francis Crick, the discoverer of the DNA molecule, years later in his lab, he posited that the variability of the order of the ACGT bases on the rungs of the ladder were actually digital code. And just like the zeros and ones that are on the computer chips in your computer, and those can be manipulated into various languages and can allow you to watch movie, or this podcast is being recorded on Kevin's computer, and it's all at the very lowest level, changing my voice into a series of zeros and ones, and the computer can read that back as my voice. So these base pairs are, of course, billions and billions and billions of characters long, and we can think of that either as a recipe for human life, or we can think of it as, in these days, as a program for a 3D printer. Many of you know that 3D printers are being used for all sorts of things, to make all sorts of complicated bits of machinery, parts of rocket engines. Even houses are being built with 3D printing, and the printing is directed by a program that the programmer designs that 3D image, and the printer is able to take whatever, either it's plastic or metal or concrete or something, and can lay down that substrate in thin layers, and together it makes something very intricate and also very, very complex. So you can think of it as the original 3D printing, that DNA. It governs the construction of proteins within cells, not only human cells, but plant cells and animal cells, and even down to bacterium, the simplest, the smallest forms of life. I shouldn't call them the simplest forms of life, because we're going to find out that not all of them are simple. Of course, that there's, what we learn is there's more to making proteins than just the chemical constituents of the proteins, but there are very, very complicated bits of information in the DNA molecule that make sure that the proteins are folded in the exact same three-dimensional lattice in order for them to function. So if you have a chain of molecules that form a protein, but that protein doesn't fold the right way, it's useless. You can't do anything with it. So very, very complex machinery within the cell to make proteins behave the way that they're supposed to. Human beings have over 3.2 billion base pairs in our 23 chromosomes. So 3.2 billion letters, let's say, in the recipe for your body. And every cell in your body, with a couple of exceptions, has a full set of the entire 3.2 human genome. Counterintuitively, the single-cell amoeba that we think of as simple life, it's just a single cell, it has 670 billion base pairs. So isn't that odd? It has over 200 times the number of base pairs or coding as a human being. You think, wow, human beings are so much more complex. We're multi-celled, we're multi-organed, we're larger. How is it that the machine code for 3D printing a human is so much smaller than the 3D code for an amoeba. And that's one of the questions in science that we haven't quite figured out yet. The smallest genome, on the other hand, exists in a bacterium that lives in the gut of an insect. I won't bore you with the name because I don't know how to pronounce it. It only has 190,000 base pairs, but that's still a lot of information. But it's such scant information that really that bacterium doesn't have the ability to multiply itself. It has to kind of invade the host insect in order to get the host to replicate the bacteria. So it kind of functions a little bit like a virus. A virus is a piece of RNA that hijacks the cell's machinery to get the cell to make more of the virus. And it inserts itself in the cell and it takes over the cell. Anyway, as science has developed a deeper understanding of the information-bearing properties of DNA, Darwin's theory of evolution had to be looked at anew, and it had to be reformulated. And now people consider themselves, if they believe in evolution, they consider themselves as neo-Darwinists, not as Darwinist, the way Darwin thought of it back in the 19th century. You see, Darwin, of course, and you're familiar with this, he said that all life evolved from the smaller, simple, single-celled organisms, and then at some point there was a mutation to make simple multi-celled organisms, and those got more complicated. And over time, those single cells were able to bond together in colonies, like algae, things like that. And the algae at some point became an organism as opposed to individual algae cells all living together. And you remember the whole idea that life emerged from the primordial swamps, and out of those swamps came more organized plants that had specialized cells for different parts of the plant and produce seeds and things like that in order to reproduce, and that it wasn't long before some very simple animal life, multi-celled animals, paramecium single cell, small, maybe sponges and jellyfish and things like that. And they started in water to begin with, and then over time were able to develop and go on land. Well, once we knew that life is controlled by DNA, this complicated code, all of a sudden thinking that just a mutation was able to, you would have to mutate the genetic code to go from one organism to another. And that adds a whole lot of complexity because I'm sure, as you know, if you ever had a computer science class and you were doing some programming, if you change a couple of lines of code, it will radically change the program that you're writing. And most of the times, if you change a couple of lines of code, your program will no longer run. It won't work anymore because each program is a series of individual discrete steps, and each step depends on the preceding step and then becomes the next preceding step for the succeeding step. And if you mess up any of that sequence, it just doesn't work anymore. So again, as we've learned more about DNA and the information in the cell, it's made the old understanding of Darwinism really untenable to science. And so now people are working on how it's possible that DNA, the simpler forms of DNA, quote, end quote, could have mutated to bring about new DNA chains that had the ability to construct different types of organisms. And you see a lot of work on particularly bacteria and on viruses because those things mutate a lot faster than, say, any animal life or plant life other than very, very simple plant life. And it's more of a challenge than the old tree of life that you remember seeing in your biology class. It's a steeper road to climb to figure out how those DNA molecules may have mutated accidentally as part of, remember, the whole idea of Darwinism is it's based on random mutation and then survival of the fittest. And the problem that DNA poses is that whenever we see information in the world, say the figures on Mount Rushmore, or say you're an archaeologist and you're combing through the jungles in mountains in Central America or South America, and you come across an old dilapidated structure that seems to be roughly square, almost completely square, you know that right angles and straight sides don't occur in nature. And so you have a theory that this is probably the ruins of a ancient civilization, a Mayan, say a Mayan pyramid or a house or something like that. Human beings are uniquely good at inferring design, being able to look at things and to tell whether they're designed or not. I don't know if you've ever gone to a museum and seen ancient arrowheads that people have found. And some of them just look like flakes of rocks to me, but archaeologists are very skilled in being able to say, oh no, this flint has been chipped. It's been worked by a human being, and it's not just a flake of rock. It's actually something that a human being hundreds of years ago produced. The same way a skilled archaeologist can look at what to you or I looks like a piece of rock and say, oh no, that's a bone. That's a piece of bone that was a part. And if they're very skilled, they can tell you what kind of organism that the bone came from. Now, remember, we said that the naturalistic explanation of the universe and all life is that there was no need of any designer or creator because life just evolved out of random mutation and natural selection. The problem with that when it comes to DNA is that a single DNA molecule by itself is not really alive. And so there's nothing for evolution to act on. How can one chain of DNA be more suited for life than the next? And when we look at the code and we see how complex the code is, what is brought to mind to us is text. This is information. The DNA molecule is more than just a very, very complex molecule that stretches 3.2 billion characters long. It carries the information. So, for example, my hair, when I had hair, was black because I'm Asian, and Asians have black hair. Gretchen's hair, when she was a kid, was almost white because she's European in background. And encoded in our DNA was the color of our hair, that our hair was going to be that color. That was encoded in DNA before we were ever born. And of course, our DNA came from our parents. And where did that design come from initially? The Rosetta Stone is in the British Library, and it was a great leap forward for the understanding of Egyptian hieroglyphics. Egyptian hieroglyphics were found in tombs in the Valley of the Kings and elsewhere in Egypt, on scrolls, things like that. And we knew that it was a language. We knew that it was text, but we didn't know how to read the text until the Rosetta Stone was unearthed. And very fortuitous for us, it was written in stone, so very, very durable. But even more fortuitous was the fact that it had an ancient script in 3 different languages. One was hieroglyphics, the little picture things that you see in Egyptian tombs and things like that. The second was an ancient Egyptian script, so not the pictures, kind of a text, but it was ancient Egyptian. And the last was ancient Greek. And we have lots and lots of understanding of ancient Greek. And that was, since it was the same inscription on all 3 of the languages, it allowed us to understand and read hieroglyphics as well as Egyptian script. Just a fascinating decoding. It was like we got the code book for Egyptian hieroglyphics. We're really, really good at, as human beings, at decoding information. Now, again, scientific materialism rests on the belief that everything arises out of random, undirected processes of matter and energy. And we said last week that the Big Bang causes injury to this belief because if you take the Big Bang way, way, way back to the very beginning, you get to a state of the curvature of gravity and matter and energy where it's called the singularity at the very beginning before the Big Bang happens, that time, matter, and energy do not exist. So how do you get from you can't even say the moment before the Big Bang because time doesn't exist yet. So how do you get from the nothingness of the original state, that boundary condition, what they call the singularity? What happens when there isn't matter and energy to bring all matter and energy and time into existence in this blinding flash? And many were against the idea of the Big Bang initially because it sounded too much like the story of creation in Genesis, creation out of nothing. Now, the things get worse for the idea that the universe is random and undirected when science observes the dazzling improbability of the finely tuned universe, and we talked about that last week. Now our understanding of the information-bearing properties of the DNA molecule make it even worse for scientific materialists than when we were looking at the creation of the universe, because to bring life into being, it appears that there have been infusions of intelligence, not just at the moment of the creation of the universe. So it wasn't just like everything, the organization of the universe was baked in when the Big Bang happened, but the information that's contained in the DNA molecule, I mean, all of the molecules and the atoms in the DNA molecule could have been on a course to being created in these star factories that produce heavier elements. All of that could have been baked into the universe at the moment of the Big Bang. But how were those molecules arranged in such a way that they bore information like the color of your hair? That would have taken a programmer to come in. It's like getting a brand new computer we all hated because it's blank. And we have to put the things that we want and are useful to us onto the new computer or the new phone because it doesn't come with those things preloaded. So someone had to intervene in the unfolding history of the universe, the natural history of this planet, for life to emerge in order for the DNA molecule to have the information, not only for human life, but all of the varieties of life on our planet. This points to a programming intelligence who remains active in the universe at least long enough to code the human genome. And this is more than just a deistic creator, the blind watchmaker who winds the watch and sets it in motion, and then from then on, the universe kind of runs itself. This is a programmer who intervenes and changes the program on the machine from time to time. I ran across a very, I think, funny quote that encapsulates the problem that the information of the DNA molecule poses to secular, materialistic scientists. And that is, chemistry doesn't care about life. So even if we can say that there were naturalistic ways in which all the elements were created in star factories that just kind of unfolded, how was that chemistry organized in such a way that it brought forth life? Remember, evolution needs something to act on. And so before there's life, how does it turn into life? And then once it's life, how does it get new information get encoded in the DNA molecule? Well, a couple of conclusions. First, a designing intelligence, what Meyer calls the God hypothesis, seems more and more scientifically plausible. Some secular scientists have said that they can buy a designing intelligence, but it must have been a super intellectual space alien who came and coded life on Earth. But see, that doesn't help us. It just pushes the problem back one generation. Where did the super intelligent space alien come from? And if somebody designed him, where did the one come before him? And it's space aliens all the way down. Where does life come from? Second, we see that the motives of those who want to hold on to scientific materialism and who have only been allowing for natural causes, that their motives are not strictly scientific. And in many cases, they're actually biased against the idea of finding a designing intelligence behind the universe. No longer can these scientific materialists claim the scientific high ground without answering to the problems with their materialistic beliefs. After 100 years in authority from the time of Darwin, now it's the scientific materialists that must start to answer some questions and to encounter some of the big problems with naturalistic theories. If you don't have an intervening programming intelligence, how do you get the world in which we live with the diversity of life that we find? Finally, for Christian people, particularly for young people, we can be encouraged as we think about, particularly think about young students. If you're thinking about embracing the sciences as a career, do so with confidence. I think people of my generation, often we had parents who were afraid of having their kids enter the science because it was feared that if you went into the sciences, you were going to lose your faith because the sciences were atheistic. And so there was a real fear of the sciences. Fortunately, during my generation, some other Christians said, we don't have to fear the science because science is just unfolding and learning about the universe that God created, so we can do so with confidence. I hope you have confidence when you look at scientific questions. We're just learning the way God did things. All right, we have one more week when we're going to be talking about some of the implications for us as believing Christians, given the state of science and faith. So I'll See you next week. Have a great week. Bye.